Now, I talked about this earlier, the view held by some observers that what we see in Indonesia today is a process of Filipinization. And they refer to this process by pointing to the emergence of two parties, two new parties in these elections, the party Gerindra, run by former Kopassus commander Prabowo Subianto, and the party Hanura, run by former TNI chief Wiranto. So the argument goes that, like in the Philippines, you now have parties that only serve as electoral vehicles for individuals who found them and dispose of them once they're no longer necessary. But in fact, if you look at how Hanura and Gerindra have done in these elections and compare to the investment that both Prabowo and Wiranto have put into this, I believe that the examples of these two parties will in fact create a disincentive for further establishments of personalized parties. Prabowo has put tens of millions of dollars of his personal wealth into the campaign. He has been hugely disappointed by the outcome. Again, if you look at the numbers, 4% for his party, where he believed he could become president. Wiranto as well, tens of millions of dollars. For the last 5 years, he spent all of his time, all of his money, all of his energy on developing the party. What has he gained? 3%. So these two parties are now the two smallest in the Indonesian legislature, and that's certainly a far cry from the ambitions of the two men. So my prediction would be that rather than more of these personalized parties, you will probably see less emerging in the next 5 years. Then the other indication that observers see for a process of Filipinization is the rise of celebrities, TV celebrities, actors, moderators, models, who have run in the recent parliamentary elections and have done pretty well. That must be said. There were some cases where, in fact, celebrities gained more votes than established political figures. This was largely made possible by a change in the electoral law, and that's a very important one, but I don't have much time to talk about it. This time, for the first time in Indonesia, a fully open party list was used. That means whoever got the most votes will get the seat in parliament. In the past, it was the national leadership of the parties that decided who will get the seat that the party won in the election. This time, it's the voters who decide that. So a huge change, and celebrities have certainly profited from their popularity and have gained a number of seats. We don't know yet quite how many, but it could be up to probably 40 or 50 in the 560-seat legislature. But, and this is what observers often overlook, that fundamental differences between Indonesia and the Philippines still remain in place. Now, in the Philippines, the engagement of celebrities in politics is much more institutionalized and much more wide-ranging. As you see here, Estrada, of course, was elected president in 2001, and as Malcolm just told me, with the highest number of votes ever achieved in a Philippine presidential election. The current vice president as well, a TV figure. While in Indonesia, the highest office so far achieved by a TV celebrity is that of deputy governor, and that is in West Java, and you see Dede Yusuf here. So a huge difference still in the extent of involvement of celebrities, and I don't see that changing much. I think the parties will remain in charge. They will make use of the celebrities to get in votes. They will get them seats in parliament and all the rest. But once it comes to really decisive, the key positions in the political elite, these will be still denied to the celebrities. So, democratic consolidation in Indonesia after 12 years, 11 years now. So, on the 21st of May, Indonesian democracy will enter its 12th year, and that in itself, and Malcolm indicated that, is an achievement. Who would have thought 11 years ago that Indonesia would still be intact as one territorial unity, that it will still function as a democracy, and that large-scale social violence has not occurred. If you think about the only other experience that Indonesia has with democracy, and that was in the 1950s, that experiment collapsed after only 7 years. So we are already in the longest period of a democratic polity in Indonesia right now. There are very healthy indications for the current democratic polity. The support for democracy remains high. You can see here there was a decline in recent years, but it's still 48% of Indonesians who say that democracy is preferable to all other forms of governance. Only 7% prefer non-democratic forms of governance. Now, the third column here is a little bit of a worry. There is an increasing number of Indonesians who say it doesn't matter what kind of government there is in place, but still, overall support for democracy is still high. Voter turnout is also still healthy, although there has been a decline this time. It's now at 72%, which is, if you look at other young consolidating democracies, still a very healthy turnout. And most importantly, currently no key political group is advocating for an alternative form of governance. Democracy is largely accepted by all political players as the only game in town. Nevertheless, I want to talk about 4 areas which remain problematic and that could potentially be obstacles to further democratic consolidation. First of all, the unpopularity of the political parties and, in particular, their representatives in the legislature. It's a little bit of a paradox that you have high turnout rates, you have high popularity for democracy, but if you have opinion polls on the popularity of politicians, these are very, very low. Now, I understand this is a global phenomenon. I looked at the figures for Australia. They're not much better. There was a poll in 2005 that said only 15% of Australians believe that members of federal parliament have high ethical standards, beating out only car salesmen in that regard. And in the United States, it's the same. So it is a global phenomenon, but nevertheless, in a young democracy like Indonesia, it must be a source of concern if the political class is basically despised and viewed as corrupt. So that has to be addressed. Secondly, and more specifically about the recent elections, there has been a decline in the quality of electoral organization since 2004. These elections were worse than they were in 2004 and even in 1999. All kinds of problems with voting lists, with complaints about people denied their right to vote and all the rest. This is a great source of concern. Now, one of the reasons I mentioned that in my paper is the disengagement of foreign donors from the process of organizing elections in Indonesia. In 1999, there were $100 million given to the Indonesian government for the elections, a lot of foreign advisors, expertise coming in and so on. In 2004, that was still 85 million, and this year it was 15 million. So you've seen a very substantial drop in the engagement there, and as a result, a decline in the quality. Third, there's an increasing commercialization of political affairs. That means that a lot of members of parliament, party politicians, become increasingly dependent on financial sponsors from outside. They either have to become wealthy themselves, or they have to take up credits, have to borrow money from their financial sponsors in order to finance their campaigns. And once they enter parliament, of course, their sponsors expect that they will be rewarded. that relates to the fourth point. Although Yudhoyono has been successful with his anti-corruption campaign, much more needs to be done. Indonesia has climbed 14 spots in the international anti-corruption index, but it's still, I think, number 140 or something. So it remains one of the most corrupt countries in the world, and of course that continues to undermine the effectiveness of democratic institutions. So come to the conclusion, 4 main points that I tried to make today. First of all, Yudhoyono and his party have won the recent elections primarily because of a massive handout of cash to the poor voters in Indonesia, and I think the figures that I've shown you were pretty compelling in this regard. Most importantly, this will, I believe, set a precedent for further election campaigns in Indonesia. I would be very surprised if parties, political figures in Indonesia would not draw the conclusion that in order to win elections you need to have these Thaksin-style handouts to the electorate. Now, secondly, if you talk about Yudhoyono's prospects in the long term and Partai Demokrat's prospects, these prospects are uncertain because it's not quite clear with what kind of popularity Yudhoyono will leave office in 2014. Everything will depend on that. And even if he is still very popular in 2014, his party is too weak and his sons are too young for an immediate effective succession to take place. Third, as I've shown, the widespread perception that Indonesia is undergoing a process of Filipinization is very questionable. According to my predictions, the rise of personalized parties in this election was a temporary one. This trend will most likely be reversed. And also the emergence of TV celebrities is not as significant as it is in the Philippines. Fourth and lastly, Indonesia's process of democratic consolidation is proceeding much better than expected in '98, and Malcolm mentioned some of the scenarios at the time: breakup of Indonesia, Indonesia becoming an Islamic state, immediate takeover again by the military, and these kinds of scenarios. So given those pessimistic views at the time, Indonesia has done very well, but there are a lot of areas that need to be improved, and I mentioned just 4 of them. If Indonesia is to further stabilize its multi-party democracy. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcus. That was terrific. Alan Gingell from the Lowy Institute. Could you talk a bit more about what happened to PKS in the elections? I was struck particularly by that slide you showed of attitudes towards corruption and the relatively low place that PKS had in that when it had set itself up, particularly, or that was one of the sort of elements that it set itself up upon.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, this is one of the areas I will discuss in more detail in my paper, so whoever's interested in that, wait for it to be on your website. But generally, PKS is undergoing a process of transformation from what was an avant-garde party in '99 and 2004 to now an established political party in the Indonesian system. In 2004, when PKS rose from 1.5% to around 7.5%. Now that was all based on a very clear platform of anti-corruption, clean governance, moral values, and so on. But that was all very easy to do because at the time PKS had only a few members of parliament around Indonesia. Now based on the 2004 election result, they had 1,100 members of parliament. And some of them, were as vulnerable to the temptations of office as their colleagues from Golkar and PDIP. Some of them were caught in massage parlors and so on. Some of them were caught for corruption. So that image of the only clean and pro-good governance party in Indonesia was eroded by, first of all, the membership that was dramatically increased in the parliament, Secondly, the inclusion of PKS members in cabinet, there were 3 of them, and they had their own kinds of issues in terms of corruption and engagement with the established political system. And thirdly, PKS took part in local elections across Indonesia, again between June 2005 and this year there were 500 elections across Indonesia. And PKS made a lot of questionable deals in some of them. They made coalitions with people who had been charged for corruption, for instance. In Jakarta, very prominently, they nominated a former police general who very openly admitted that he basically bought the candidacy from PKS, and the numbers were all in circulation. So that image of PKS went out of the window. There was also, just recently in these local elections, 2 key provinces were won by PKS, and that is North Sumatra and West Java. And that was very important for voters to see, well, now we have PKS governments in our areas and nothing happens. In fact, some of the developments led to a decline of PKS support in these areas. There was a case in West Java where the new governor wanted to ban some cultural dance because he believed it was too sexually arousing and this sort of stuff. And of course you can't do that in a province that is very deeply committed to Sunda culture, and this dance was an expression of Sunda culture. So after that decision, and there have been polls done about this, the support for PKS dropped radically. So to answer your question quickly and shortly, PKS is now an established party. Its rise as sort of a non-establishment, anti-establishment party is over. And in a sense, it's seeing a normalization of its support. But nevertheless, again, to make this point, it's the only party beside Partai Demokrat that gained in these elections. So it went from 7.3 to 7.8, while all the others lost significantly. So it is not completely unsuccessful. And secondly, it is now the most influential and the biggest Islamic party in Indonesia. That's also an achievement. Now PKB was the largest Islamic party in the last election, and now PKS, which started from a very low base, 1% in '99, is Indonesia's key political party in terms of political Islam, and that's an achievement as well.
Thanks, Marcus. Jan Riecher, one of Malcolm's ex-students, actually. Couple of questions. First of all, could you comment on the role of the vice presidency? And secondly, I was wondering if you could also comment on the fact, or how did the government handle crisis as in earthquakes, floods, and so forth? Did that have any role in the election outcome at all? Thank you.
Can you specify your first question?
The first question is, if I recall correctly, very early days when Yudhoyono came into power, the vice presidency, at least in the media, played quite a vital role in consolidating the democratization process. And further and further into the reign of Yudhoyono, you wouldn't hear so much, at least in the media, about the role of the vice presidency in this. Thanks.
And first of all, about the vice presidency, it is electorally important. So the general rule is, if you're a presidential candidate from Java, you look for somebody who is from outside Java. So Yusuf Kala fulfilled that criterion. So I believe, yes, he was important in 2004. So once we talk about the electoral significance here, it won't be as significant this time. I believe that SPY could basically now run with anybody and still win, even if that person is from Java, a woman, or whatever. It doesn't really matter, and he knows that. So he is currently now playing hard to get for everybody who wants to form a coalition with him. And it's very different from 2004, where he actually was on the lookout for somebody who could gain electoral votes for him. And it was a long negotiation with Kalla at the time before they came to an agreement. This time, it will be SPY who will tell the VP, he says, I've chosen you and you're the lucky guy, or the lucky woman, we don't know yet. So there's a change there. The vice presidency being electorally important in 2004 and probably not so much this time. In terms of Yusuf Kalla's role, throughout the 5 years, yes, he has been crucial in solving the Aceh problem. He has been crucial in a lot of the economic decisions that were taken. But towards the end, of course, there was increasing discontent within Golkar about the fact that the vice presidency didn't gain them any support. So they said, yeah, our vice president is doing a lot of work, is basically driving the whole economic policy of the government, is solving the Aceh conflict single-handedly, and look at the polls. Golkar is falling through the floor, and SPY, because of the cash programs, is up in the sky. So Golkar, in the last phase of the campaign, tried to dissociate itself from the government and came up with the idea of sending Kalla into the race as a presidential candidate. So for a while it looked like the two were separated. And this is why SPY is now so reluctant to go back to Kalla and say, well, it doesn't matter. 3 months ago you challenged me, but now you come back fine. So he's now, that's what I said, he plays hard to get. Kalla wants to run with him again. Golkar clearly wants to be in government, but now it's SPY who says, wait a moment, now I'm in the electorally almost unassailable position, and I make my choice, and I'll do it slowly. Natural disasters, I don't think it played a role at all. All the polls that I've seen, again, they all point to issues of poverty, issues of the rise of the price of rice and other basic foodstuff. Corruption is then number 12 or so with 5%, but there's no attention paid to these kinds of issues.
Thanks. Trevor Rowe next.
Marcus, thank you very much, and I would join in the applaud for your presentation. I thought it was very crisp and to the point. But you sort of touched on a question I was going to raise when you responded to Alan. But from an investment point of view, the big challenge of dealing in Indonesia is firstly the corruption, particularly the provincial corruption. Secondly is the bureaucracy, particularly the provincial bureaucracy, and this whole issue of secure of tenure in terms of, in the good old Anglo-Saxon context, access to title. They're the three major issues, and it doesn't strike me that President Yudhoyono has made a lot of progress in those three areas based on some involvements I have through companies I'm involved in Indonesia, and just wondered where you thought that would go. And I was surprised during the election, they really didn't get a lot of airplay. I would have thought foreign investment and the need for foreign investment would have got a lot more airplay, notwithstanding the nationalist aspect of it. Thank you.
Again, I mean, you have a very effective anti-corruption going on at the elite level. And again, it's unprecedented. And I continue to be surprised every day when I read the papers what's possible these days. I mean, parliamentarians who are followed by the KPK, the Anti-Corruption Commission, are being arrested in front of, running cameras. Their phone conversations are being taped and played in court, all kinds of intimate details coming out. So there is now this shame factor for Indonesian politicians. But again, it's only affecting a few selected targets. And this is where Yudhoyono thought he actually had to sacrifice one of his own family members to show that he's not picking the targets. But still, arresting an immediate family member doesn't solve your problem in the provinces and the districts where the problem is still very, very significant. Now, one of the things that the KPK, the Anti-Corruption Commission, is thinking about now is opening up offices at the provincial level and to district level. Now, the positive reading of this is that you will have more arrests going on at these two levels. The negative reading is that you don't have that many qualified anti-corruption campaigners to fill all these positions. Therefore, you will have to fill them with all kinds of unqualified people who will be counterproductive to the effort. So, but the jury is still out on that. Again, this has not happened yet. The KPK is a strictly national organization, has only one office in Jakarta. It has a few liaison sort of offices in the regions, but the idea is to branch out, and maybe then more will happen in this regard. But again, I wouldn't tell you to be optimistic about this. I mean, it will continue to affect some of the political elite, but corruption as a culture, you know, and it's not only in the political elite, in the businesses and so on, it's everywhere. You know? So corruption is the sort of cultural premise upon which a lot of Indonesians do their business. You know, whether it's going to a government office or just, you know, getting a contract somewhere, it's just so deeply entrenched that I really can't tell you it will be better in 5 years' time. Same with the bureaucracy. In fact, what SPY has done is establishing more bureaucracy. I mean, now with these cash programs, for instance, this was a huge program, you know, by which new offices were established that evaluated the eligibility of people. And it was an ad hoc program that was placed nowhere within the existing bureaucracy. Again, I believe this was done so because voters should get the impression that in order for these programs to continue, we would have to re-elect SPY. If it was an established institutionalized program of social security, then, well, under Megawati or everybody else, it could continue. But it was done in this very bureaucratic, ad hoc way in order to make sure that people understand this is an SPY program. Foreign investment. In fact, and this is part of what I was talking about, the sort of taxonization of welfare policies. Part of that is, of course, a very nationalist undertone. And SPY has used that. I mean, one of the things he's proud of is kicking the IMF out of Indonesia. You know, that was something, whenever he attended a campaign rally, it's one of the things he would raise. My big achievement, the IMF is no longer here. And in the context of the emerging global economic crisis, he has always said, we don't want the IMF back in Indonesia. We want a regional solution. We want to work with China, Japan, and so on to create this trust fund, you know, from which then Southeast Asian countries can draw, but no IMF. And it was very powerful. Secondly, you had somebody like Prabowo, who is fiercely nationalistic, and basically his platform is, you know, Indonesia is a rich country that's being exploited by evil foreigners. That's the basic outline. Gerindra means Gerakan Indonesia Raya, the Great Indonesia Movement. It basically means let's return to Indonesia's great noble roots, you know, in the 14th century when we were a big country and so on, before the foreigners came. So in that kind of atmosphere, no candidate would have dared to say, yes, we need more foreign investment. You may see it now that the election is over, but certainly not during the elections.
I think we have time for one more question, and this gentleman up front has been the most patient.
Mike Johnson of This and That. Really extending from your last answer, in the mid-early 90s, we'd look at the growth rate, and if it fell below 6%, we'd all get worried about political cohesion because of economic downturns. So you didn't really mention that particularly in your conclusion, but it's a subplot. Could you say a few more words on that? And finally, did the President recommend to Prime Minister Rudd to use the cash splash technique for holding together elections?
Yeah, the economic growth issue, I mean, I mentioned that in passing when I explained some of the figures here. So again, you had, at a time when Indonesia's economic growth was back to the Suharto days, again, I think the second quarter of 2008, 6.4% economic growth. Very healthy growth. But SPY got these numbers, 58% of Indonesians saying, I'm worse off economically than a year ago. And at the same time, you have economic growth going down. It's now probably at 4% or something like that. And but because of the cash programs, Indonesians are happy. They say, my economic condition is better than it was a year ago. So I think you will see a shift in the second Yudhoyono term away from that fixation on economic growth. That's something he has learned in the last year. Now, before that, he would go around and say, aren't we great? We're back at 6.4%. And Kala would always make that point. You know, we have overcome the crisis, we have healthy economic growth rates, they're better than in most other Southeast Asian countries, so why don't we get credit for that? But then the complete departure from that, saying, let's not focus on economic growth, we have to make sure that the individuals are happy, and we can only achieve that by what Thaksin did in Thailand. So I think in the future, as an investor and sort of economic observer, you could expect much less concentration in Indonesia on these kinds of growth rates because they don't deliver politically. And if these elections set a precedent, then it's certainly for these kinds of populist economic policies. On RUT, I don't know. It occurred to me as well that Indonesia is not unique in that kind of sense. I mean, I'm German. I'm not an Australian citizen, but in the last election campaign in Australia, I followed was it Porkometer or something like that in the Sydney Morning Herald, where every day the offer by the opposition was weighed against the offer by the government. It was 60 billion versus 60.3 billion or something like that. So yeah, it's quite similar. But obviously, if you have that with a very poor population, which is politically still rather, open to political manipulations, it's a bit different from a consolidated democracy like Australia's, where people make more informed choices based on these kinds of things than in Indonesia, where democracy remains vulnerable.